You really paint kind of a bleak, almost alarmist picture of where the American democracy is now. You quoted Jonathan Turley, who's a constitutional scholar from GW Law School. He said that the 109th Congress is so bad that it makes you wonder if democracy is a failed experiment. If the framers went to Capitol Hill today, it would shake their confidence in the system they created. I mean, do you think it can be salvaged now, or do we need to just blow the whole thing up and start over?
Well, they've made some changes since the 109th Congress. The 110th Congress is a little bit better. One of the things that was really alarming about the last Congress is how little they worked. I mean, right. They really established what was functionally a two-day work week. They would arrive. Typically, they would have a half day on Tuesday, and they would leave at noon on Thursday. The Senate had 11 work days that were less than 1 minute in the 109th Congress. They worked something like 2 full months less than the historic Do Nothing Congress of, I think it was 1949, 48 or 49, something like that. These Democrats that have come in this time, they've reestablished the 5-day work week. They've done away with a lot of these terrible things that they were doing last time. Like they had these late night sessions where they would pass, all the important legislation would be done in the middle of the night away from the eyes of the press or behind closed doors in these secretive committee meetings. The legislation would be rewritten. That stuff is, for the most part, ended. And then they've also brought back things like the open rule, which is a law that can be debated on the floor before it goes to a vote. Under the last Congress, they didn't have a single one of those.
Right.
So they've done some correcting of that process, but on the other hand, they claim that they reformed the earmarking process, and they didn't at all.
Right.
There was even a hilarious instance of that was the Iraq supplemental. Remember the much debated bill they had last year to refund? Well, in the beginning of the supplemental, there's actually a clause that says there are no earmarks in this bill, pursuant to the new reform, et cetera, et cetera. But if you actually look in the bill, like 3 pages later, there's $192 million worth of earmarks for the new FA-18 airplanes and that sort of thing. They're counting on the fact that nobody reads this stuff.
Yeah.
And the fact of the matter is that they're right. I mean, all they have to do is really announce there's no more earmarks in this bill, and as far as the media is concerned, there aren't. But that stuff is going to catch up to it. But the problem with the earmarking and all that stuff is that the amount of money that goes into Congress now and the amount of influence that congressional campaign contributors have, there's just no way they're going to be able to stop it unless they do any real reform in that score. And all this stuff about skirting the rules and having late night hearings and that sort of stuff, all that's been done to allow commercial interests to get in and rewrite the legislation and subvert the will of the voters. And until they address the issue of money in politics, they're never ever going to fix that. So I don't see any serious effort in that score, and that's why.
Well, you just mentioned open rules and the Rules Committee. In your article, 4 Amendments in a Funeral, you talk about that and how it can exert all this control over the lawmaking process. Can you just briefly describe what the Rules Committee does?
Yeah, the Rules Committee is basically this committee that decides whether or not a law or an amendment, a bill or an amendment is going to be sent to the floor to be voted on. So say you have a bill and you want to introduce an amendment to it that says, for instance, to the Patriot Act, you want to introduce an amendment that says that the government can't execute searches of your library records, all right? So you go to the Rules Committee and you say, I'd like to put this amendment in the bill. And the Rules Committee looks at it, and what they have been doing for the last 15 years is they'll close the doors, and they'll go back and they'll meet secretly at night, and they'll come back the next morning and say, sorry, you're not in it. And so whoever runs the Rules Committee has the power to decide pretty much entirely what gets voted on in Congress. So even if you have a majority of the Congress that is in favor of your amendment, if you control the Rules Committee, and the leadership of Congress always controls the Rules Committee wholeheartedly, there's no voting that goes on there. Wow. They're allowed basically to decide what gets voted on and what doesn't. Also, and this is really interesting and something that most people don't know, is that if, say, a committee sends a bill to the Rules Committee, right, like the Patriot Act, for instance, and the relevant committee, like the Justice Committee, has been working on it for months and months and months, they can take that bill, throw it in the trash, replace it with an entirely new bill that's been written by anybody, and then send it to the floor to be voted on the next day. And it will be voted on an hour or 2 hours after it's been released to the Congress, and it might be 2,000 pages long and no one knows what's in it. So they have the power to completely change legislation and nobody knows this.
I mean, I consider myself, pretty well informed. I
Right.
had no clue that this was going on.
Right.
And I mean, to me, it's a I don't know if it's a scandal, but it's a huge story that people should know this. I mean,
Sure.
why aren't people? Do people not care, or is it not really interesting? I don't know.
It's a mystery, but it's also it's complicated, and
Right.
complicated news doesn't do well with American journalism, just because it's hard to sum up. That took me 30 seconds to describe that. You're not going to get that on network news.
Right.
It's been true for years, for ages, that even after a bill gets passed in Congress, it has to be reworked by what they call a conference committee. It's a committee of the Senate and the House, and they get together and they take the bills that have been voted on in the respective houses, and they refashion it, and they send it back to the two houses. Well, that committee also can rewrite the bill completely and have it never be voted on. And so they're allowed to do whatever they want to these bills, and the voter, really never has any influence on it. As long as you run the relevant committees, you can pretty much control all of this stuff.
You mean, is there a way to reform this?
Sure, there is. Every year, what they do is they pass this thing called the rules package in Congress, which it's basically it decides how Congress is going to be run that year. So they can change how the Rules Committee operates. They can say that the Rules Committee doesn't have the power to change legislation, for instance, and that can be voted on by the entire Congress. So, I mean, I think if enough people knew about this sort of thing and they petitioned their congressman and said, look, we'd like you to do something about this next time around, yeah, it can happen. There's no reason that it can't happen. And they've done a little bit better with that stuff this year. I mean, they've cleaned up a lot of that stuff, but it's still true for the most part.